Hey there, welcome to School of Emo, the podcast where we dive into the world of emo, pop punk, and everything in between. If you've ever found yourself in your car screaming the lyrics to Taking Back Sunday, wearing way too much eyeliner in the early 2000s, adding a buckle or a chain to every outfit you've put on, you are in the right place. I'm Erin Judge, and each week I will be your fellow student, guiding you through the music, the culture, and the history that shaped an entire generation of angsty teens. I am not the teacher of this school. I am a fellow student, here to learn alongside you and from you. Together, we will cover a lot of information that doesn't really matter, but will remind us of the days of stalking MySpace channels and getting lost in chat rooms. So connect your dial up, turn on your webcam, and let's go to School of Emo. Today's episode is one I'm so excited about. I've been looking forward to, had to pull out the checkered vans for, and that is the origins of pop punk, discussing all things pop punk and how the pop punk third wave of emo worlds collided and kind of came together to create this nostalgia driven community that we all put under the emo umbrella today. And it's the part of it that I love the most. I think we've talked about it. The bands I'm drawn to very much more on the pop punk side. So I'm very excited about today's episode. And I want to just note that, while we are talking about pop punk, and it may be easy if you are very much like emo's emo and pop punk does not fit in emo and that drives you crazy. And so you want to tune out. There is still going to be a conversation of how the emo space, again, kind of influenced pop punk, where it divided, where things kind of meshed and came together, and the role that they play in each other's journeys as genres and the popularity that they have today. So we will talk all things pop punk, the genre that lived between rebellion and radio, mosh pits and mall tours, emotion and silliness, all the things. We'll explore the headlines, interviews, and even some of the cultural moments that have defined the wave of pop punk and everything that it influenced today in this fourth wave, rebirth, revolution, whatever we want to call it. So before we get into the pop side of things, we have to start with the punk and what really laid the groundwork for what followed and the bands that followed. In the 1970s, music was bloated with over the top progressive rock and arena acts. So several bands achieved legendary status in the 70s rock scene, like Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, the Eagles, Queen, the Rolling Stones. These were cited as some of the most popular and influential bands of this time. This truly was the era of like rock music and this kind of rock that had more personality to it than what we had seen previously, like true rock and roll, music festivals, all of that was really hitting a high in the 70s. There were some other notable bands like Fleetwood Mac, Aerosmith, Kiss, Black Sabbath, The Who, all defining this period of time and what people were listening to. But something was headed to mix it up and break it up a bit, because prior to the 70s, these were the bands that in the music that was not necessarily as much available. But at this point, it was widely accepted. This was the norm. It became the new pop, right? It became the things that people loved. And so the wrecking ball that mixed it all up was punk rock, the raw, aggressive, anti-establishment movement in the music scene. Kind of leading this way, we have the Ramones, who released their debut album in 1976, which included 14 tracks total, all under 30 minutes total. So short tracks. And a headline at the time from New Musical Express from the UK in 1977 was "Punk Rock Will Kill Rock and Roll." So we have bands like The Clash, Sex Pistols, Black Flag. They didn't just play fast, they played against everything. But one band hinted at something catchier, and that was the Buzzcocks, with "Ever Fallen in Love with Someone You Shouldn't Have." Emotionally charged lyrics with punk speed and pop structure. So the music itself, if you listened to it, didn't necessarily stand out as much. Like the melodies blended this rock and pop that we were already listening to, right? Not we, I wasn't around then, but the culture at the time. But the lyrics are really what set this apart and became a movement that was so kind of raw and abrasive, I guess you could say, to the point where people did think like this is ruining music, and it was like this alternative scene. So it was political and alternative to the culture, something the rock bands at the time also flirted with, but not as direct and aggressive like punk bands did. So again, it wasn't that different, but just different enough. Like we saw when we talked about emo, right? And how it came to the forefront. Looking at the Descendants, their album in 1982, Milo Goes to College, introduced a new lane, which they called Punk with Heart. Their lyrics focus on school, girls, awkwardness, standing in stark contrast to hardcore punk's politics, which would later become the pillar of pop punk in other decades. In an interview with Milo Ackerman of The Descendants, this was done in 2014 by NPR, he said, "We weren't trying to be pop punk. We just liked love songs and fast songs. The emotional part, that was just us being honest teenagers." So that leads us into the 90s boom, right? The 70s, we have the rise of punk causing a wave in the scene. The 80s, punk rising to the height, right? Grunge starting to be formed, laying the way for what we experienced in the 90s, which we consider to be the boom of pop punk. So the 90s were a musical battleground. We had grunge and alternative radio with new metal and rap and rock rising in other spaces. The 1990s grunge movement was a subculture that was centered around a specific type of rock music that combined punk rock with heavy metal, and it is noted to originate in Seattle, Washington. I'm sure that can be highly debated, just like where emo originated or where we want to, say it came from. But in the United States, that's also a thing to note. We have Seattle, Washington as being kind of the distinct area that had the combination of fashion and also music to define this subculture within the rock and alternative space. So while both the music and the fashion were integral to the movement, the music arguably led the change, initially influencing the fashion trends and later being propelled into mainstream consciousness by bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam. This rose in popularity in the United States around the same time that early emo bands emerged underground. So this was kind of happening around that same time as the first wave of emo, showing how punk and rock were evolving into different styles, blending with other genres. And that's really important, I think, as we think about how they come back together. We have rock, we have punk. Now we're having a bit of this kind of grunge punk that has a little bit of emotion to it, but really defining punk rock. And then we have this other part of like punk metal, rock metal, pop metal that's now considered emo, like the new metal into emo wave that's happening with pop kind of hanging around in the middle, ready to influence both sides. Which leads us to that overlap, right? Where did pop really come in and infuse into punk? Green Day. A 1994 headline of Rolling Stone says, "Punk goes platinum. Dookie destroys the charts." Dookie, which was Green Day's it's their first biggest notable album, sold 10 million copies, proving that punk energy and pop melody could hit the mainstream. So they were political and aggressive with the cultural statements that they made, like punk. But if you ignored the lyrics, it would be pure pop. So they were able to be consumed, right? People, they were palatable to people. People enjoyed them. They were able to be on radio, even if the lyrics were still very much punk and very much alternative. They were accepted in a different way because of the melody and not necessarily listening to what they were saying, which unfortunately has continued to this day, where they tend to be a bit misunderstood until people listen to the words they say, which then throws those people off because they were not paying attention. So following that, we have The Offspring with Smash, Rancid, NOFX, Bad Religion, all carrying the punk revival forward and sort of blending a little bit into that pop space, right? Green Day did it the best, but we have this punk rock into pop slowly from a lot of these bands. But then came along, a little more in the 90s, following Green Day pretty closely, Blink 182. which really took it to the next level with the evolution of pop punk. Their breakthrough came with Enema of the State in 1999, which featured What's My Age Again and All the Small Things, some of their biggest hits even today. It was juvenile, but it was also self aware and anthemic. When we think about the humor and kind of the silliness that's infused into pop punk, especially in the early 2000s and throughout, again, the end of the 90s, which also overlapped a lot in the emo space, Blink 182 is the picture perfect band of that time, bringing that to the forefront. There was an interview with Tom DeLonge of Blink 182, 2001 MTV. He said, "We wanted to make music that sounded like a fart joke and a love letter at the same time." And if you've ever been to their show, you know that that is still true. That is who they are at their core. It's almost like the teenage boy that was struggling and like wanted to be emotionally vulnerable, but had this like harder exterior of like, I need to make a joke to like cover this up. It's like the difference of like Dashboard, right? And Chris Caraba, who just leaned into that emotional vulnerability. The Blink guys covered it up with this kind of humor and sarcasm. But if you really listen, to the lyrics and like peel back the layers, it is still highly emotional and like connected in that way. And there is still a punk kind of anti the machine, like alternative to the culture that's still involved. So pop punk stood out by being fun at a time when grunge was pretty dark and introspective. We could say emo was a little gate kept and maybe a little too intense. Pop punk brought the speed and smiles at a time when alt rock felt too heavy and gave people a new way to escape and enjoy music as well as process their emotions and the lives that they were living. So then that leads us into the late 90s and the early 2000s, the rise of the third wave of emo, where pop punk and emo officially collided. So while Blink 182 made punk accessible in a pop punk way, bands like the Get Up Kids, Saves the Day, and Alkaline Trio were working on something a little bit deeper: emotional, vulnerable lyrics with punk tempos. So taking it to another level of like really leaning into the emotion side of it, maybe a little less of that sarcasm and humor built in, and then leaning into the punk side, but still maintaining a little bit of pop along the way to separate it just from emo. A headline of Alternative Press in 2000 was "Too emo for punk, too punk for emo," which is a common problem that I think still exists within this scene, this space that we've talked about here quite often, is that there's a difference between punk and emo. But there's also a lot of gray area in between that bands find themselves in and that people find themselves in. There's all these subcultures that overlap with each other, and it can be hard to define. And at this point in time, this third wave of emo was successful partially because of what was happening in the pop punk and alternative space, right? If we did not have the bands that were as palatable leading the charge and making this type of music interesting and exciting and trendy and popular, the emo bands of the time likely would not have been able to create such big waves at us in the mainstream way that they did, which is important because that led to the longevity of these bands that we still enjoy today, the albums we get to see, the tours that we get to be a part of, right? That is part of it. You have to have some sort of mainstream success to get there. And a lot of the emo bands that did not find that blend or like kind of ride into this wave failed in that way, in that they didn't have that long-term success and even the ability to stick with it and make money from it, right? Make it a part of their life like we would hope and that we want from a lot of these bands. So this time in this era really allowed space for bands that kind of bridge this gap and fit in the middle, that maybe were hated and loved at the same time. One of those being Newfound Glory, who began bridging the gap with their album in 2002 called Sticks and Stones, which layered heartbreaking lyrics over fast-paced riffs. We also had bands like Something Corporate, talked about Andrew McMahon, The Starting Line, that blurred pop punk, emo, and piano rock. We have Jimmy Eat World that was kind of paving the way as well around this time. fitting into, both of these spaces while also not fitting into one of them perfectly. Jordan Pundick from Newfound Glory did an interview in 2002 with Fuse, and he said, "We always thought pop punk meant singing about real stuff, your friends, your parents, your anxiety, but with riffs that you could stage dive to." What we also saw from a lot of these bands is that even within an album, you may have a song that you would categorize as truly emo, right? You may have one that is more punk rock. You may have one that is very punk pop that would be played on the radio. There was a lot of diversity within these bands, and like each song could kind of fit into a different space, because at the core of all of it is this kind of honesty, vulnerability. And at the time, because of the world we were in, right, the culture of the time, a lot of that vulnerability of not fitting in and not knowing, how to navigate life, like that was very alternative, which was very punk, to kind of talk against that and express emotions that were counter to those things. So you can see where that blending happened so organically, just because of kind of the culture and the space of the time. So pop punk became the emotional cousin of emo, more upbeat than what we saw with like Thursday and Sunny Day Real Estate, those emo four founders, but tapping into the same heartbreak, which then led into our mid 2000s explosion, which we can also call Warped Tour royalty, the biggest rise of both pop punk and emo. So from 2001 to 2007, pop punk was everywhere. It was the soundtrack to high school hallways, TRL, Hot Topic. And looking at some of those heavy hitters that have created their legacy and still maintain it: Fall Out Boy, emo lyrics with pop punk energy; Paramore, the wonderful, beautiful Hayley Williams, really blending those worlds well; Avril Lavigne, our true pop punk princess; Good Charlotte, the anthems for suburban misfits; Simple Plan, the kings of self-deprecating pop punk, our little Canadian guys; and then Yellow Card, one of my favorite bands of all time, California pop punk with a violin that just worked. There was so much diversity within this space. And because emo and pop punk were rising in the mainstream at the same time and kind of became besties and rose together, it allowed for bands to have a bigger impact and a lot of bands to fit into this world. There was a headline in Spin in 2004 that said, "The pop punk takeover, angst sells." And then a clip from Hayley Williams from BBC in 2007. "I grew up listening to Blink and No Doubt. I didn't see girls fronting pop punk bands, and I wanted to change that." Which I think is such a good explanation of like their band is like this. I would probably say more of a combination of like a No Doubt meets Green Day meets Blink 182, maybe, but such an important thing, and like leaning into that genre. This era also gave us Drive Through Records, which became a pop punk factory. So again, something corporate, the early November, Finch, all flirting with emo, but packaged for the pop punk crowd. The checkered Vans, the belts, Warped Tour as a whole, I would argue, is more pop punk than it is actually emo. And without pop punk, again, we would not have had the success of the bands that we consider to be so strongly emo in that third wave and beyond. My Chemical Romance, right? The Used, all of these bands that have had success. In the 2010s, so after this rise, just like what we saw with emo, there was a bit of a fall or downward trend, I guess, as all genres began to take on new legs and streaming became a thing and more accessible. We had the pop punk identity crisis. So by 2010, pop punk faded from the spotlight. Indie rock, EDM, hip hop all took over our airwaves. Some bands broke up, others evolved. But pop punk didn't die, it just went underground. So it became a little bit less available. And many of us, myself very much, just clung to the old bands that we loved in our now Spotify playlist versus just our CDs that we had before. So we had bands like The Story So Far, Man Overboard, Neck Deep, The Wonder Years, list goes on. They carried the torch in the DIY scene, known as the Defend Pop Punk era. So, this phase, because it was a little less palatable and less mainstream at its core, became grittier with more emotional depth and self awareness. There's a headline from Noisy in 2014 that said, "Pop punk's not dead, it just grew up." There was also an interview from Dan Campbell of the Wonder Years around this time, and he said, "We weren't writing about high school anymore. We were writing about rent, loss, therapy. We were growing up, we were evolving. Millennials were stressed, right? We were the ones carrying this forward really in the early 2000s, but now we were trying to work and navigate life as adults in a world that was very different than what we were promised, right? There was stress involved. And so we weren't giving as much to the bands that we loved so much because of that. And that was evidenced by even Warped Tour leaving the scene during their final full country tour in 2018. Now, before we get into what happened after this kind of underground pop punk phase, leading us into where we are today in the 2020s, I do want to talk a little bit more about this kind of pop punk versus emo rivalry and discussion that has gone on through different threads, festivals, online and in person. So, if we think about the late 90s to the early 2000s, which was the rise of debates among genres, right? Because of the internet and accessibility to more people, chat rooms, like being able to really differentiate thought processes, right? And have these kind of battles and debates among groups within some genres. And so we had absolutepunk.net, LiveJournal communities, Yahoo groups, MSN music forums, early MySpace pages. And some of the observations made at this time is that emo and pop punk often coexisted on the same bills, meaning Warped Tour combined them, different shows, even some concerts like openers might be in a bit of a different genre than the headliner, but Scene Kids began making some distinctions. So, as an example, an Absolute Punk user from 2003 wrote, "Saves the day as emo, Newfound Glory is pop punk. They're not the same, but I'll scream along to both." That's a very nice version of this. There are debates even still today over certain bands. Are they emo or are they not? And there's a lot of gatekeeping to that. And even, we're just saying two genres here. There are subgenres of emo and pop punk that kind of got worse and more divisive even as the internet became more widely available. Some other common threads, debates around this time over what is real emo versus radio pop punk. Pop punk was seen as fun, emo was emotional and artistic. The bands that were more pop punk were accused of selling out. Emo was described as music you cried to, while pop punk was music you jumped to. Lots of different distinctions between them. And again, like I mentioned, a lot of bands within one album, songs could vary across the spectrum, which made these debates even more lively and kind of confusing. There was a lot of crossover in festivals, like Warped Tour lineups for sure. If you look at, between 1999 and 2005, you had a blend of both. So some big pop punk hitters, Blink-182, Sum 41, Good Charlotte, Simple Plan, Avril Lavigne. We have emo, The Used, Thursday, Taking Back Sunday, bands that were higher in that space. Fans would often comment online, Warped Tour is going soft, too much emo, not enough real punk. Someone mentioned on Punk News in 2004. So lots of debates over this side of it. Now, getting into the 2000s, 2005 to 2009, that's where we really had the height of the MySpace era and more genre blending as a whole. So some of the key platforms were MySpace. Now we had the development of MySpace fully. So bulletins, band profiles, top 8 debates, which was such a big deal. YouTube comments, YouTube was available, and pure volume. Some of the trends, we had Fall Out Boy, Paramore, Panic at the Disco, blurring the lines more than ever. And then online fans debated whether these bands were really emo, pop punk, or something else. This is also the time where we had, right, the rise in like the scene and what that looked like. And unfortunately, again, the internet has a lot of negatives in the way that it creates this type of aggression and like defense towards like your grouping and like who can be in or out and all the rules that need to be a part of that. A typical comment thread around this time was, Fall Out Boy is not emo. Pete just wears eyeliner. But their lyrics are so emotional. That's emo. Have you heard Jawbreaker? That's real emo. So lots of, again, exclusivity. And we also were blending generations of those who were in the first wave of emo and the second wave of emo, then the third wave of emo, leading to the debates we still have today of like, where did emo actually start? What is actually emo? Who are the founders of emo? All of that. Some of the festival notes at this time: Warped Tour expanded further, adding synth pop and even post-hardcore, so they were even more blended, and probably leading to their downfall in a way because people got frustrated, but it needed to happen. Bamboozle and Taste of Chaos emerged as emo-heavy alternatives from a festival sense. Emo kids were in skinny jeans, neon hoodies, and side bangs, but they were now considered more mainstream fans. Again, we had that fight over like what was emo versus scene, and still exists today over the look of it and where you fit in and how you have to be. And then in the 2010 to 2015 range, we had Tumblr and the great genre of reclamation, which we're going to get into more. But during this period of time, we have Tumblr threads and aesthetics. We have Reddit, and the emo pop punk Reddits are intense. Twitter scene kids, emo revival zines and blogs like the Runouts. So more accessibility to some of these different spaces and opinion, thought makers, all of that. Some of the cultural trends: Tumblr nostalgia during this time fueled renewed interest in the early 2000s emo and pop punk. So people took this on again, especially the scene kid space. Emo revival acts like The World is a Beautiful Place, Foxing, Modern Baseball were seen as separate from pop punk's warped era bubblegum angst. So this is kind of a period where people were begging for more of these on like background underground shows. And there was a debate over that and what was actually emo. Those, again, first and second wave emo fans were really heavily debating what was truly emo at this time. For festival trends, pop punk lived in Warped Tour, so they went more into the pop punk space, whereas emo really took over the DIY festivals like the Fest in Gainesville. Crowds were rarely overlapping like we see today, and fans online noticed. So there was actually talk about how the crowds were fairly distinct, which I find fascinating for what we have today. And some of the Reddit posts: why do pop punk bands keep singing about high school at 30? They wanted evolution. Is the emo revival just indie kids who like crying? It changed, right? It was a little bit different. Very interesting. So that leads us into that and beyond, right? Now we're getting into the 2020s. Pop punk and emo both were sort of asleep. There was this other genre cultural piece happening. But in the 2020s, we have the revival where pop punk goes Gen Z. So today, pop punk is back, just like emo, but it's evolved and more blurry across genres than ever. So thanks to TikTok, nostalgia as a whole, right? Every Gen Zer wants to take on the early 2000s aesthetic, even the sound, all of those things. Pop punk comes along with that. And then artists crossing genres, the revival is real and it's here and it's different than what we've seen before. So Machine Gun Kelly, Tickets to My Downfall, which was produced by Travis Barker. Machine Gun Kelly also just headlined Warped Tour, which is interesting. Olivia Rodrigo's Good For You album, Billboard #1, but very much Paramore-esque, right? Meet Me at the Altar and Pink Shift, redefining who gets to be in pop punk. Kenny Hoopla, Youngblood, having a huge resurgence in the rock space. Willow. These are all genre blending icons that are kind of newer to the scene and still evolving themselves, but really with that pop punk background to their music. A clip from 2021 of Edith Johnson from Meet Me at the Altar said, "We're not reinventing pop punk, we're reclaiming it. This genre belongs to more people than ever." And then a headline from Billboard in 2021, "The pop punk revival is loud, diverse, and finally inclusive." I don't know how true that is. I think what we're actually seeing, and we talked about that a little bit with the kind of emo fourth wave of, is there a revival? Is it just pure nostalgia? I think that there is a divide, and I think it's a generational divide, which probably is what was happening during that third wave, mid 2000s of emo. where people who were really heavily involved in the first and second wave didn't really want to get on board with what was happening in the 2000s. But, millennials, we were on board. That's what we grew up with. And so I think there's two shifts happening right now. One is the new bands, or the artists that are kind of hitting the top of blurring genres and maybe even more mainstream, that have a completely different generation of fans compared to the bands that were part of Work Tour, that now we're all going back to Work Tour for, the new festivals or the emo cruise or this podcast, right? I'm not listening to a lot of these new bands. I'm listening to the bands I grew up with and the bands that were part of that third wave highly. And I think there's a really big divide. There is a little crossover, like we talked about with Pierce the Veil, right? They have a younger audience as well, because they were on that back end of that, kind of that into the 2010s of like their rise. My Chemical Romance, I think because of the theatrics and just how mainstream they were, they have a kind of more of a diverse set of fans compared to some of the bands like The Used, for instance, which is going to be a little bit older and definitely more of like the millennial generation. So I find it really fascinating. I think it's true of pop punk, like even Blink 182. The makeup of fans is still probably very much millennials, maybe a little older, not as much Gen Z. I think Gen Z probably would find Blink-182 fairly cringy. We kind of saw that with the festivals last year. Like, are they going to grow up? Well, they're still talking about the same things. Like, those conversations are happening because that crossover just looks different of like what we're looking for in music. And I think what this like resurgence, revival, whatever we want to call it, looks like in both spaces of emo and pop punk. But I do believe that where I am at, right, and where we are in the bands coming back together, like resurgence of Warped Tour, but also like the emo cruise and all these spaces, this podcast. Um, it is the blend of pop punk at its height in the mid 2000s with emo at its height in mid 2000s. Like we're pulling from that. And that's where a lot of people do blend and cross over. I am very emo. I'm very pop punk. Like I like both pretty equally. And I blend them together. And that is what I like, right? I'm not a scene kid. I never was. But I'm a fan of the music, which I think is sort of the revolution of it all. And then there is a younger generation that is creating their own scene. I think we'll see a rise of the scene again, like we're seeing it come up to the forefront. It's cool, right? Grunge kind of became cool. Alternative is cool. And so we're seeing a bit of what we saw through the 90s into the 2000s. So of course we're going to see scene at its height and like the craziness of that. And hopefully new bands taking on that mentality as well. Like Generations, it all just kind of repeats itself, which will be really interesting to see. But we'll also see us kind of continuing with where we are. And so it's interesting just thinking about the different worlds that are being lived at this time in these different musical genres. I'm excited about it. I would definitely love to see pop punk at its height in the radio and like taking over TikTok, honestly, online. I watched reality TV, I like that stuff. And I know pop songs, but I don't listen to pop radio. I don't listen to country music. I don't listen to a lot of that stuff. And so if it was infused with the sounds that I love so much from the music I do listen to, that would be exciting to have around me a little bit more. The world I would love to live in. So as we wrap up, what is pop punk? So pop punk has worn a lot of outfits. The angry teen in the 80s, a class clown in the 90s, a heartbroken romantic in the 2000s, a grown up with anxiety in the 2010s, and now a kaleidoscope of sounds, identities, and stories. Pop punk thrives because it evolves and because it tells the truth, whether you're 14, 24, or 40. It's vulnerable, it's honest, it's still fun in that process. It stood out in every phase by doing what other genres weren't, bringing speed to vulnerability, bringing hooks to heartbreak, and bringing emotion to rebellion. If you liked this episode, let me know. Subscribe, leave a review, a positive review. Because we're going to keep talking about this. We are going to get into some more of these emo bands, right? I have shows coming up. We've been talking about what's coming. We're going to get into some of the biggest pop punk bands as well. That will come definitely. So there's a lot more to come your way. But if you enjoyed this episode or you have something that you want to share, just like with the origins of emo, there's a lot I don't know, and maybe your perspective on it is different, like, please share. You can share on socials. I'm not as active through that account, but would love for you to share anyways. You can also comment if you're on YouTube, or go to YouTube, comment on this and start a conversation. That is always a great way to interact and, again, make your perspective part of this episode. And then if you want to come on and share your own stories or perspectives or bands you love, as always, you are welcome. My email is in the show notes. So please just reach out to me and I will set it up and we can have a little conversation together and hear some of the things that you want to share as part of the class, because we are all part of the class together. So thank you. And I'll see you in our next class.